afternoon. Russian landscape painting. Landscape was of immense importance in 19th century Russian painting. In this talk, we shall consider the social, economic, geographic, and cultural forces that prepared the emergence of landscape as a genre. We shall further discuss the specificities of the artistic language of Russian landscape painting and how they enabled landscape to become a more definitive reflection of national identity than any other art form or pictorial genre produced after early 18th century. We shall also try and reveal landscape painting as an early driving force for expanding the academic artistic vocabulary. A few words on why landscape painting became a major paradigm shift. The introduction of Western painting at the turn of the 18th century and directions which Russian art was to take were a result of Peter I's reforms and priorities. The background to developments to the figurative arts during Peter I's reign is an almost complete absence of secular art in the reigns of his predecessors. Plans for a secular academy of the arts were not realized in Peter's time, although various projects were put forward. In 1716, for instance, a proposal was made for establishing a school for Russian art students in Rome, where they were to learn to paint battles and assaults on towns, in order to make a most precious ornament for Your Majesty's home, for the eternal glory of Russia with your illustrious victories. Further learning, history and fable, which is most useful in their profession for thinking up new subjects. In other words, there was little room for landscape, and the landscape that there was inauthentic and served as a mere background to heroic scenes. In 1757, the Russian Academy of Arts was founded in St. Petersburg. The Academy promoted a neoclassical style and technique. The first rector was French, and the French hierarchy of genres was established and taught, whereby the noblest genre was history painting. This is one example of the output of the Academy of Arts. And we shall see in a moment another, which illustrates that even when the subject matter was set in indigenous and national history, the backdrop was still supposed to evoke the noble Roman antiquity. However, before long, new currents were starting to emerge, of which an example is this portrait of a peasant girl in Russian dress. We shall note the year of its production, 1784, only just decades after the Academy of Arts was established. The affectionate treatment of the model, attention to the detail of the folk dress, and conventions of aristocratic portraiture applied to a peasant lady signify a point at which priorities shifted from historical scenes and portraits to images of contemporary life. With the entire paradigm of classical painting being very new and entirely imported, it had only existed a few generations before the need for a more grounded art, engaged with reality, arose. The first landscape painter that we are going to be looking at is Alexei Venetsianov. The name does sound as if it were derived from the word Venice, Venezia, and this is because their family were descendants of Italian immigrants. A civil servant and artist, honored by the Academy of Arts, he resigned from the civil service, left St. Petersburg, and settled on an estate where he practiced his art. There, he founded an art school, through which at least 70 students passed, having received a thorough artistic training. More broadly, he became the founder of the Venetsianov School of Painting, characterized by a sense of stillness, affectionate treatment of native landscape, realism combined with abstraction, and the meditation on the orderliness of the universe. We can also see a combination of academic training and the more traditional icon painting in this work. For instance, the top of the headdress of the peasant lady in the foreground evokes a halo, while her figure is reminiscent of the Virgin Mary with child. Venetianov offers a metaphorical reading of the land and peasants cultivating it as a motherland giving nurture. This painting is by one of his students, one of Venetianov's students, Nikifor Krylov. The painting is in the State Russian Museum, and I must say that many of the paintings at which we will be looking are housed in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, which we shall also discuss shortly. The painting brings to mind Bruegel with his landscapes and peasant scenes. However, the peasants in this work are moving about their business with serenity and a pretty natural calm, which confer a sense of timelessness on the scene. The impression is intensified by the stillness of the figures and the air, a sense of stasis permeating the mise-en-scène. Also, while clearly a generalization, the scene is very uncluttered. Time seems to stand still, based in the shimmering frosty light of an early evening afternoon, reflected off the snow. The composition is unified by a gentle blue color scheme echoed across the painting. Another pupil of Venetianov's was Grigory Soroka. A view in the Spasskaya. Spasskaya is the name of the state where this painting was created. Iconicity and an air of everlasting harmony characterize the painting, as do an existential calm and the cosmological unity of man and nature, in another interpretation of the world as a temple. It is interesting to note how in these early paintings, academic means of expression are employed to produce a deeply symbolist reading of landscape, born out of traditional indigenous worldview. By the middle of the 19th century, a new social class of bourgeoisie had appeared and went from strength to strength in the course of the century, following the loss of status, wealth, and power by the landed gentry. The reform of the liberation of the serfs had far-reaching ramifications. The balance of forces changed, and as one consequence, the bourgeoisie obtained a taste-forming agency. The new patrons, whose background was strongly informed by folk and religious sensibilities, were disseminating and supporting a new set of tastes, different from imitations of exotic antiquity, but inherently akin to the works discussed above, actively encouraging a new paradigm of artistic expression. It is important to note that the merchant industrialist patrons were not uneducated or lacking in sophistication. On the contrary, having received a very good education, having been on a grand tour of the industrial centers of excellence, as well as artistic, with aesthetic sensibilities informed by a wide variety of sources, they gave preference to the indigenous and had the means to promote indigenous expression. One such family were the Tretyakovs. Pavel Mikhailovich Tretyakov, whom we see on the left, with one of the children in his lap, was the founder of the Tretyakov Gallery. Here is the gallery as it is looking today. The official date of the foundation is 1856. This was when the first pieces produced by the Domestic Art School entered the collection. The gallery was given to the city of Moscow as a gift in 1892. Well, this was a joint gift of the two Tretyakov brothers, although it was one, Pavel, whose photographs we saw a second ago, who specialized in fostering the indigenous artistic expression. By this I mean that he decided to found a gallery that would focus specifically on collecting indigenous art, which is produced on a domestic subject matter and also by Russian or indigenous artists. This is to mark a departure from the illustrious, really brilliant, absolutely world-famous collections housed in the palaces of St. Petersburg. But that was art produced elsewhere, and the country expressly lacked a collection of national painting. Another such patron was Sava Mamontov. Here we see him in his studio. He was a patron of arts whose multifarious contribution to Russian art is immeasurable. Much of the artistic endeavor took place on his country estate of Abramtsevo, near Moscow. Speaking of landscape, on the right-hand side, we see an impression of the estate. It is a museum nowadays, and it's possible to visit. In terms of landscape, what he did was he fostered an entire school, a cohort of landscape painters, by providing a space, physical and metaphorical, for them to exercise their various imaginations and to foster innovation and experimentation. He furthered their work by sending their landscapes to international exhibitions, and including World Exhibition in Paris, and they were fetching awards, including gold medals, and were otherwise favorably received and very favorably commented upon in contemporary critical discourse. Both Sava Mamontov and Tretyakov, the gentleman here, engaged in the dissemination of art through various means. Firstly, they were commissioning art. They were again sending it to international exhibitions. They also contributed generously to organizing a new kind of exhibition for Russia, which was a traveling exhibition. Annual exhibitions that were showing, presenting the arts not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the traditional centers of artistic excellence, but also were taking them around the country. They were called the itinerants or the wanderers, and that also helped very much to bring their art to a much wider audience. And once again, their art met with very warm reception and enthusiastic acknowledgement and recognition. This is a photograph that shows us Sava Mamontov outside his private carriage, in which he commuted to his Moscow office every day from his country estate of Abramtsevo on the Northern Railroad, which he himself built. That just explains a little bit of his own background. And the first landscape painter that we discussed was Venezianov, but this was the first of the later painters who received a more formal education and who were training already in Moscow in the newly established Moscow School for Painting and Architecture. So this was Savrasov Alexei Andratyevich, one of the pioneers of Russian landscape painting, a follower of the Venezianov school, which we discussed earlier, the author of the first landscape acquired for the newly founded Tretyakov Gallery, and the artist who exerted a formative, prophetic influence on landscape painting tradition in Russia. He was further instrumental in shaping landscape painting as an independent genre. That painting is called A Step in Daytime, produced in 1852. Savrasov was one of the first and preeminent exponents of landscape painting and domestic subject matter. He was one of the first to travel inside Russia in search of inspiration specifically for landscape. To be very honest, he was simply one of the first artists to travel in Russia, landscape painting or not, and literally discovering the country, but particularly, yes, putting it on the map within the remit of landscape painting. Here he was traveling to the south of Russia, and he produced a whole series of most inspirational landscapes, which he presented at an exhibition, which was met with enthusiastic acclaim by the patrons of the Academy of Arts, who were representatives of the imperial family. And he was invited subsequently, if we look at this painting, another one, he was invited to St. Petersburg to become a copier of old master paintings, because he excelled at producing sunsets, and they looked so very romantic and appealed very much to the sensibilities of art collectors who were raised on old master paintings. The artist declined that magnificent offer, and it was a pivoting choice. If I allow myself to return to the previous painting for 1 second, we shall notice here the same sense of stillness and a very uncluttered scene. It is a contemplation indeed on the infinite horizons, on the expanses of the steppe. And the haze, the color palette that unifies the sky and the steppe. And this is a device that we shall see in numerous other paintings, when the composition is divided horizontally almost in equal parts, with sometimes the greater share of the landscape is given to the sky, and essentially it becomes a skyscape. And in an attempt to infuse the painting with light and air, so that it's all based in this very warm, glowing sunset and indeed air. What we observe here is a combination of the sublime and the subtle, the sublime majesty of nature, but also the humble foreground. When we look at this rural path and the very unprepossessing shrubs and grass, if we look at this in a close-up, we shall possibly notice that there is a difference in the brushwork applied to the depiction of the sky and the foreground. The sky is very polished, it's very smooth, a very academically polished impression of the sky and sunset. However, when we look at the ground closer to us, closer to the viewer, the brushwork becomes much sketchier, much more expressionist, if I may use the word, much more broken, and much more spontaneous. The paint is applied in impasto. And this was certainly a pioneering technique at the time. And here the artist demonstrates how easily he oscillates between various stylistic approaches in a truly pioneering way. We shall look further at the painting which marked another one of his major breakthroughs. And it was also, well, the rooks have returned. The painting was presented at the exhibition of 1871, and the critics at the time hailed it as an entirely new departure, as a whole new beacon in landscape painting. It was described variously as one that entered into Russian culture in the same way as the field and the forest have. It was described as a sacred prayer, and the artist was described as possessing of a sacred gift to perceive the mysterious voices in nature as yet not discerned by any other Russian artist. Savrasov himself described his engagement with nature in the following words: "Nature is unceasingly breathing, always singing, and its song is full of majesty. There is no more exalted joy than to contemplate nature, because the world is paradise and life a mystery, a wondrous mystery." So why was this painting so special? Why was it described as a sacred prayer? Here, yet again, we see this combination of various emotions. It signaled a lyrical engagement with landscape, and also it's a very humble scene, and microcosm of a greater creation. These rooks that have returned, they signify that the arrival of spring. And there is a borderline human condition between melancholy and also exalted and almost ecstatic joy. It's difficult to pinpoint which emotion dominates in this painting, whether it is indeed a joy because spring is arriving, or a bit of this melancholy feeling at this very subdued scene. And this well, particularly this lyrical approach, the poesis of the subtle and of the humble is what struck a chord in a period, 1870s, when realism was reigning supreme, when the overriding concern of society was of a moralistic nature, and suddenly it was somewhat divorced from a very kind of social discourse, trying to discuss the fate of the peasant masses. It was completely divorced from this, and more a conversation of the eternal and our space of the human being in this image of microcosm and creation. Here is a plaque commemorating Savrasov on the wall of the school, Moscow School of Painting and Sculpture. Later it also became of architecture. He taught there for 25 years and was responsible for a whole new generation of landscape painters. And in the background of this plaque, what we see is a reproduction of an impression of this very painting. Right, this is another close-up, and I showed it here to illustrate yet again the contrast in the approaches to brushwork. The sky is again almost a watercolor. It is not a watercolor, but it's very gentle and various gradations very smoothly blend with each other, while the texture of the old ancient church is shown in a different brushwork technique for us to feel almost all this paint peeling off and the ancient air of this 17th, as a matter of fact, century church. Another painting by Savrasov is called Rainbow. The rainbow here is shown as a spontaneous pillar of light with all its connotations of light, life-giving force, and a whole new approach towards the treatment of landscape. If we look at the way the grass is treated, to the left of the central axis of this composition, it's treated as the areas of color rather than it being a faithful translation of every glade of grass onto the canvas. It's treated as a block, kind of en masse, which was also a very new approach and stylistic device in not only landscape painting, but generally in the period when realism was looked upon as the highest achievement. If we also look at the path leading up the hill, it also is almost sketchy, suggested as if a sketch, as if it were an unfinished painting, although it was indeed finished. That was also a very pioneering device. If we look at the figure of the lady at the foot of the steps leading to the top of the hill, she appears completely minuscule in comparison with the dwellings on top of the hill. This experimentation and playing with scale and perspective imbues the thing with additional symbolism. And this motive, this particular treatment of a rainbow will become, if not a template, but one of the motives to be emulated by other artists. I also must note that if during the early stages of his career, he was absolutely embraced by the artistic community and by art collectors and connoisseurs alike. Later, the more experimental his artistic vocabulary was becoming, the less understanding he was meeting in artistic circles, which is why one can with much justification say that his painting was prophetic. His findings would be taken up later, but he blazed a trail for landscape painting, at least in the 19th century, in the very long 19th century, which was also the formative period for the national school of artistic expression in general. Right. Another painting by Savrasov is called Volga, Expenses. The Volga was the majestic Russian river, which is very part of the national law. He was also one of the first artists to start traveling, as I mentioned earlier, but he did not only travel to the south, but he also traveled east, particularly to the Volga, also in trailblazing motion, because subsequently many others, both his students and generally as this new approach towards domestic landscape painting took hold, it was almost a necessary pilgrimage that every self-respecting landscape painter was supposed to undertake to travel to the Volga, and many would return year after year. So it became an established trope, in a sense, to go and find motives and inspirations, not only for landscape, but also for genre painting on the shores or banks of the Volga. What we see here is another contemplation on the infinite, not only the physical infinite horizons, but also the cosmological infinity. And yet again, it is as much a skyscape as it is a landscape, or indeed a waterscape, and the conversation between the surface of the water and the sky reflected in it. These reflections and these shimmering echoes, we have seen them in Savrasov's other paintings, and they will also become a recurrent motif in other artists' work. And yet again, one cannot but be surprised and almost astonished by how generalized and abstract the treatment of the various aspects of elements of this landscape is. He does not translate or transcribe the grass, the flowers, indeed the flow of the river, and then onto the canvas, but treats them in a very generalized way, and in a most pioneering motion yet again. Later, the same approach, stylistic approaches to rendering landscape will be found in Scandinavian painting, and of course in the Russian school as well, but that will be later. And this will be the last painting by Savrasov. The dreamlike effect achieved through a brilliantly exercised economy of means and masterful handling of color. Tiny droplets of water became crystallized on the boughs, resulting in an image of a translucent fragility in a beguiling palette of shimmering hues of turquoise and gray, visualizing the mystery of a unity of heaven and earth in the human soul and nature. This painting is called Winter Landscape, Frost. This is an example of the infatuation of Russian landscape painters with winter in general, and his own personal affinity with the winter, and also just a very almost vulnerable fragility of this of the frost, and as I described earlier, this brilliant economy of means and how the entire scene is unified in this color scheme of blues of pearlescent, mother of pearl tones. Savrasov was the archetypal artist to demonstrate what made Russian landscape painting distinct, namely that its overarching concern was striving and arriving at a depth beyond visible reality. That once realism arose, the dichotomy between realism and abstraction did not exist, and that landscape painting, although fully anchored in the reality of the times and of history, operated on the level of abstraction. The next artist to discover is Fyodor Vasilyev. As we see from his dates of life, he only lived 23 years. Unfortunately, he died very young of tuberculosis. So this painting is entitled Wet Meadow. What we see in this painting is another combination of the subtle and the sublime. However, the sublime here is interpreted as the formidable forces of nature, more in tune with the traditional, for instance, German romantic school, romanticism in landscape painting. However, he finds inspiration and drama in the everyday, transforming the scene through capturing the lurid lights the moment a thunderstorm is to break out. Vassiliev was an exponent of romantic realism. Realism indeed had various and most diverse interests and concerns. And so if in Savrasov we saw a lyrical approach, and in Venezianov it was almost metaphysical, well, not almost, it was metaphysical. And here we see this romantic understanding and interpretation of realism. And literally, the painting is divided into two parts. If one is all about gathering clouds and thunder and lightning, absolutely literally, the other part is still seemingly tranquil, but it's this quiet, the loud before the storm. It's a very charged painting, but the characteristic here is, again, is that he was finding it in the environs of St. Petersburg, and all this drama was now being found in domestic subject matter. So he was heroicizing a very humble domestic scene. Another painting by Fyodor Vassiliev is called The Thaw, and this painting focuses on the exploration of the change of seasons, transitional states of nature, and on its immutable laws, instilling awesome wonder and grateful contemplation. The brilliant handling of a minimalist color palette with subtle gradations, creating a complex mood of melancholy and joy, but mostly joy. It's remarkable that it's exactly the same year, 1871, as another painting which was focusing on the same transitional state of nature and also the arrival of spring, as we discussed earlier, with the rooks that had returned. And the mood here is possibly slightly different, and one that illustrates the fundamental value of embedded perception, or the value of mimesis in perception. Because, say, it's not really obvious that it is an uplifting and a joyful landscape. For many, it would seem more like a brooding landscape and steeped in melancholy. However, to the native eye, it is more, again, it's on the contemplation on the eternal change of these seasons, how one prepares the arrival of the next, how it's not so much a rivalry, but one succeeding the other, and how each one of them is majestic, the majesty of winter, and how it is being overpowered, overwhelmed by the warmth, encroaching warmth, the tentative arrival of spring, and this timid arrival on the one hand, and yet so manifest already in this colossal thaw, rendering the pathway almost impossible to navigate. And again, this merging of the sky and the earth at the distant horizon. And the dwelling here in the middle ground on the right-hand side does look very humble, but it's not meant to instill contemplation on mortality. Rather, it is really endearing. It's meant to be endearing. It strikes a chord of the humility and the cordiality which are to be admired. And they did strike a chord with the national mentality. And this subdued color palette is not at all an exercise in brooding. It's a faithful portrayal of an early spring day. And as a matter of fact, again, that sun, which is trying to break through the clouds, is bringing light indeed, and it announces the arrival of spring. And yet again, that's not to say that winter somehow is only celebrated when it's on its way out. Winter was very much loved. But this period was characterized by deliberate exploration of all things, not transient, but transitional. The transitional season or transit between night and day, sunset and sunrise. And the next artist that we are going to consider is Vasily Vasilyich Vereshchagin. The name is difficult to pronounce, so I shall repeat: Vereshchagin. A Navy officer and artist, held in equally high regard as an officer and as an artist. Vasily Vereshchagin, at graduation from Sea Cadet Corps in St. Petersburg, is represented on the photograph to the right. He was an indefatigable traveler. He traversed the entire Russian Empire. He also found himself in the Tibet. He has completed his education as an officer in St. Petersburg, and the very next day almost enrolled in a class to study painting. He also traveled to France to study in a private academy for a short period of time. He set up a studio in Munich on his own means. He was of aristocratic descent, but he also always remained an active officer and equally true to his two vocations, as an officer and as an artist. This painting shows to us Kyrgyz kibitkis. A kibitka is a nomad tent. It can also be a covered cart or a sledge on River Shum. A truly remarkable painting in many respects. Firstly, it is anthropological and another type of realism. If you compare the background and the foreground, we see that it's almost as if a photograph with a photographic effect, a blurred background, very blurred mountainous landscape, also suggesting a distance. And in focus, we see essentially a portrait of this nomad tent. At the time, the artist was traveling in Turkestan. He was literally putting the area on the map. He was documenting it, because he was asked to do it, but also as an artist who was simply very interested in exploring various areas of the country and of the world. He was mesmerized by the detail of everyday life of this very enigmatic and little known in Russia tribe, or the lifestyle of these nomadic tribes. So we see very carefully drawn and painted totemic embellishment on this tent, and also the rugs or the carpets that are so integral to this dwelling are shown in very much detail to show the indigenous design and how it was employed and cherished indeed in the everyday life of the Kyrgyz, while themselves are suggested in a very expressionist manner. It must also be said that Vereshchagin had traveled. He traveled in France. He traveled in Germany, and as well as Savrasov, I must say. So they drew upon a wide variety of sources, and what we see in their production is an appropriation and interpretation and adaptation for domestic means and purposes of artistic vocabularies and paradigms of expression drawn across very different schools of painting, very different understandings of indeed the vocation of art. What art is for? Is it to try and engage with reality and change it for the better, or is it art for art's sake? Or is it simply being a hymn to beauty? So in this very formative age, 19th century, and particularly its second part, when a formal training arose not only in St. Petersburg, but in Moscow as well, was a very different tradition. So in this formative stage of Russian painting, including landscape painting, we see that it was nurtured by a great variety of artistic vocabularies drawn across the world, and both the academic, artistic, and those vocabulary, and those nascent views as well. Vereshchagin in the mountains of Alatau, from the Turkestan series, which I mentioned before. It was painted in Munich after impressions of visits to Turkestan in 1867, 1868, and a later one. Mountains dissolving in the haze create an impression of infinite distance, while the eagle, hovering high above, suggests boundless depths beyond, and as a symbol of longevity and rejuvenation, contributes to a message of harmony, eternal regeneration, and timelessness. The composition, with a close foreground and shivering expanses in the distance, was a recurrent device in contemporary landscape painting. We also observe a daring use of color. The mountains and the sky are almost monochrome, devoid of naturalist transitions. Interestingly enough, when in the second part of the 19th century, this monochrome approach is looked upon as very new, if we remember some of the paintings we looked at earlier, the Veneziana school, we also saw paintings based in a very, if not monochrome color palette, but one that was unifying all the elements of the landscape, and also almost monochrome, which seems to be a leitmotif of earlier, something that brings together the early landscape painting and the later one, school. Somehow this painting looks very modern. And interestingly enough, one interesting feature is that this foreground, which is very sharply defined, is also the more realist part of the canvas, with, if not alpine meadow, but the Turkestan meadow delivered in rather exquisite detail, with the flora of that area depicted rather faithfully to the actual flora found in that area. And a very timeless deer as well. All of this speaks of timelessness. The next painting is Evening in the Himalayas. That was a sketch, but it was also a time, it was called a sketch in the critical discourse at the time. But again, with the rise of various interpretations of what a finished painting is, this may well not have been a sketch. And when I looked at this painting, I remembered the line from a book, The Poetics of Space, Immensity is within ourselves. This line continues as soon as we are alone, we are elsewhere, and especially alone with nature. This and similar paintings embodied a yearning of the human spirit for a cosmological, metaphysical communion and clarity, providing a new motive and artistic language for the existential dialectics narratives seen earlier and produced henceforth. It's just a few seconds for you to have a look at the painting without my talking over it all the time. The next artist to consider and celebrate is Ivan Shishkin. The painting called Rai, which we saw at the very beginning of our talk. And he was an exponent, at least in this painting, of epic realism, cinematic, panoramic views. He employed photography as a repertorial technique. Why am I talking about photography as a repertorial technique here? Shishkin embraced photography dearly. He practiced it, and also in his work as a landscape artist, he only ever aspired to be as good as nature. He didn't seek to reinvent it or imbibe it with some new interpretation or new meanings. He admired nature as was. In his tutoring, and he was a tutor in a landscape class in the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts, he sometimes, or not even sometimes, it was his teaching method, would place a photograph next to his pupils and ask them to please copy it, for them to enable them to copy nature as faithfully as they could possibly accomplish. That was another approach. We saw, for instance, Savrasov, or we saw Vereshchagin, who treated it differently, but he thought that he only needs to be as close to nature as possible, and as a matter of fact, some of his graphic works, he was also a graphic artist, are still exhibited in Düsseldorf, in a museum there, because somehow, well, I'm not trying to say that the Germans are very known for their attention to detail, but Shishkin's attention to detail appealed to connoisseurs of art in Germany. Metaphorical interpretation of motherland as nurture, the enriching reading of, the enduring reading of landscape we saw in particular in Veneziana's work, is also apparent in Shishkin's approach to native landscape. And if we spoke earlier of the field and the forest that entered into the iconic narrative of national identity, so this is one of the prime examples of how they can enter this discourse. Shishkin was also a poet of the forest. This painting is one example, Forest Expanse. The panoramic cinematic views were another trademark of classical landscape painting. In the case of Shishkin, faithful to the actual landscape, but also philosophically conceived. An oak grove. The might and permanence of the oak trees evoke the same associations as they did, for instance, in England. The forest for Shishkin was one of the crucial symbols of national landscape and, by extension, identity. Morning in a Pine Forest. This is one of the best known landscape paintings and paintings in general in Russia, and this entertaining and touching and equal measure painting offers an example of affective realism, which sought to elicit an emotional response in the viewer. We have by now encountered an array of realisms, metaphorical, or this one is affective, epic, photographic. The little bears and their mother were not painted by Pushkin himself, by Shishkin himself. He asked a fellow artist and friend to paint them into the painting. And there are sketches, preparatory sketches for this painting executed by Shishkin, which suggest that he experimented painting the bears in and out, trying to capture the spirit of the forest, what is best with or without, and eventually opted for the bears and this playful scene. And well, again, it's a combination of light, how it penetrates the very dense forest. And in the left-hand corner, we see these roots and the lichen befriended and almost time befriended. And in the depths of this epic forest, we see this very national family of bears. And yet again, it's one of the most famous paintings in the entire paradigm of Russian painting. In the wild north. As the geography of travel and discovery expanded, so did artistic concerns, remaining nonetheless within the paradigm of metaphysical contemplation on the majesty of nature, on solitude and belonging, strength and comfort, an experience of interiority and transcendent togetherness. At the time, the North was also being put on the map of Russia, and as we possibly by now have discerned, the development of landscape went hand in hand with the development of travel, and the landscape was one of the means of, in fact, encouraging travel, because as the visualization of the country was being brought to the various parts thereof, so was the awareness of the multiplicity of landscape, of its diversity, encouraging travel, but also various other concerns of the epoch were dictating the development of railways and various other means of communication. And Sava Mamontov, whom we saw earlier, for instance, in order to facilitate his project of railroad building, subsidized travel to the north of some of the artists whom he was, for whom he acted as a patron, precisely with an explicit task to please bring back scenes of the north, to visualize it for various kinds of public, including those on whom a decision to start the construction of the railway depended. And this was not the only expedition, but again, the greater the exposure to the imagery, the greater the captivation and the hold it was experiencing on the collective imaginary of the artists. Isaac Levitan, well, in English, the name could be pronounced as Aesop, but Isaac in Russian is another artist who entered into the pantheon of Russian landscape painting. He was a student of Savrasov, whose work we had discussed in some detail. And he unfortunately died very young of heart disease and left numerous, if I remember correctly, 300 unfinished paintings and sketches. He was also one of the exponents of travels to the Volga, found numerous inspiration there, although his first trip somehow left him unimpressed. He found it very somber, it was leaden sky, absolutely nothing to inspire, and no comfort and joy. But he went back and subsequently was returning year after year. This particular painting is called Golden Autumn, and this is not the Volga, it's the environs of Moscow region. The Golden Autumn is not only the name of this painting, it's a period from late August throughout September when the foliage and the forest start to turn colors. This indeed is a jubilant display of color and the writer's display of color in the face of the inevitable demise and in the face of the winter. But another contemplation, another way to interpret this period of golden autumn is really not so much as the defiance in the face of winter, but rather as this circle of nature, and each of the periods is given its time to display all its goodness, all its wealth, everything which it possesses, before the next season comes and does the same. And so this is one such interpretation. Also, Isaac Levitan was much impressed and very well familiar with the work of the Impressionists. And for instance, if we look at the way the shadows are treated here in the left-hand side, they are any color but black. We see the greens, we see the purples, the browns, which is a very impressionist concern. The dialogue between the sky and the interaction of the sky, of the light with the surfaces. Right, so if we look at his next painting, this also evokes a painting by Savrasov, which we saw earlier, the one produced in 1871, where the rooks that have returned, spring, big water. Big water is another phenomenon when the snow starts melting. It's a recurrent phenomenon that never comes as an unexpected disaster, and rather it's another sign, another symbol of the arrival of spring. And Levitan was the most dedicated student of Savrasov, whose work we saw earlier, who absorbed his mentor's teaching on the lyrical in nature. Characteristically meditative outlook, the mutual extension of the expanses above and below, the sky reflected in the water, the interplay of reflections of sunlight, the tenderness and effulgence of the young trees, landscape metaphysically and metaphorically construed, nature seen as a mediation for human condition. Well, very much an exercise in light, and it's a lightscape as much as again a skyscape, waterscape, a continuation of the exploration of landscape as we've seen it before. Another artist who was not a landscape painter, but whom we should consider in the framework of landscape painting, Viktor Vasnetsov. In this painting, which is entitled Bogatary, Bogatary are legendary warriors. They are mighty warriors. The rolling expanses in the background symbolize the motherland, with the mighty legendary warriors in the close background, equally symbolic as guarding her frontiers. Here, landscape is yet again employed as personification, and landscape is interpreted symbolically as the expanses of the motherland. And in the foreground, this close foreground, we see the warriors who who are seen in full of resolute determination to firmly stand their ground in the face of any potential trouble. And that trouble is also symbolized by the gathering clouds. And overall, again, it's a metaphorical and metaphysical reading of landscape, the rolling expanses. And Vasnetsov was very much engaged with visualizing fairy tales, and many fairy tales deal again with the warriors and traversing the country on various quests. And here is one such employment of landscape as a metaphor. Vasily Pereplotchikov was lesser known, but we are looking here at his work as an illustration of fascination with winter and with the north and with symbolist artistic preoccupations. He did indeed travel to the north, and in the Arctic, there is this division for polar night and polar day. And when they are based on this light, but it's eerie light, it's not the same as the daylight, same in the other areas of the world. And here we see this mystical light as a unifying device, as we have seen it in numerous other paintings. Pereplotchikov also traveled to the Urals, the Ural Mountains, again as an example of an extended itineraries and how landscape was fueling the exploration of Russia. And another artist who deeply engaged with the Arctic was Alexander Borisov, Spring Polar Nights. He was a rather legendary figure. He was an artist, but he also became an explorer. His work was very much embraced by Pavel Tretyakov, the founder of the gallery, and he subsidized his subsequent expeditions, like this one, for instance. Here we see Alexander Borisov and his team on board the yacht Dream. That was an expedition Alexander Borisov mounted to Novaya Zemlya. Novaya Zemlya is, I don't know if we can, let me see if I can manage to do, just annotations, spotlight. Novaya Zemlya is here, and Scandinavia, Britain. So that expedition was arranged, heavily subsidized by Pavel Tretyakov. He was absolutely enamored of Alexander Borisov's work. And while Borisov also assembled an illustrious crew of scholars, because he meant it to be an exploratory trip. But Tretyakov, in his turn, asked Borisov to show the work that he will have produced to no one before Tretyakov himself, because he wanted to be able to buy all the work that he liked for his gallery before anyone else was able to do so. That particular exhibition was really a huge story because, unfortunately, it set out a little bit later than they originally planned. As such, they were caught in drifting ice, and slowly but inexorably, they were taken some 200 kilometers away from where they hoped to be. Eventually, they realized that they had to disembark. They did. And then, as this ice was breaking, the lovely dogs drowned. Their food reserves drowned as well. And they really reached a very critical situation and were prepared to heroically meet their deaths until they were, when they were suddenly found by the natives, by the indigenous people of that shore where they were finding themselves, and everyone survived miraculously. So that was not the last expedition, and that did not stop or dampen their exploratory ardor. And Borisov went on other expeditions. Sorry if I can, I don't know why I cannot now go to, oh yes, thank you. For a moment it just didn't work. So he continued to organize expeditions and produce artistic work, and he was hugely successful. Here, for instance, he is shown at an exhibition in London. He also exhibited in the States, which is quite remarkable considering that you had to cross the Atlantic, and not by plane. He was invited to meet Roosevelt, and for his artistic and exploratory endeavor. He was also a very grateful person. What in this particular painting, we see a glacier dedicated to Pavel Tretyakov. It was finished after Tretyakov died. Tretyakov died on the 4th of December, 1898. But when in his mapping of the new territories that he was discovering, this glacier was dedicated to Pavel Tretyakov in grateful memory for his help, generous help with his endeavor, with Borisov's endeavor. Another painting of the North by Vasily Pereplotchikov, whose work we saw before. And here we see a whole different artistic vocabulary, which is more akin to post-impressionist and symbolist. And indeed, by then, the artists had been exposed to all these new vocabularies of the turn of the centuries. But this concludes perhaps our the narrative of the exploration of the country through the medium of a landscape. And with the last artist to see today, Arkady Rylov, Sunset, also in the North. And a complete departure from the realist engagement, rather Fauvist, if we like. With the last painting in the blue expanse, with a combination of everything, both symbolism and the eternity, and all the elements communing in this one scene. And perhaps we shall summarize our discussion by saying that in the course of the 19th century, landscape painting saw the following developments: a reversal of cultural paradigm, a recovery of indigenous sensibilities, falling in love with indigenous landscape as a matter of artistic concern, and landscape painting providing a major impetus for experimentation with artistic techniques and vocabularies. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And as a goodbye, we shall look at this one very happy painting in the end by Borisov, Winter Sunny Day on Northern Dvina. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, and with this I shall conclude.